I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome back. Appreciate your being here to check out another opus of the podcast built to decolonize classical music. In preparation for this episode, I was thinking about this idea of decolonizing classical music. For folks who are relatively new to the show, it's not about taking Beethoven and decolonizing him as much as it's about taking this notion of classical music, so-called classical music, as I used to say all the time, and decolonizing our notion of it. I'm really excited about today's guest because in a really interesting way, he does both. I talk a lot about the rigid, invisible walls that have been built around the so-called classical music ecosystem, questioning who decides what belongs in the concert hall and what happens when those Eurocentric boundaries are challenged. Well, Joachim Horsley is a phenomenal pianist, arranger, and composer who is doing that work with the piano. He's exploring this musical universe where great titans in music like Beethoven are channeling Havana and Lagos and Port-au-Prince as much as they're channeling Vienna and Leipzig. So a decade ago, after immersing himself in the study of Afro-Cuban rumba, Joachim had a viral hit called Beethoven in Havana, which is an arrangement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, where he used the physical framework of the piano itself as a percussion instrument, in addition to playing it in a really virtuosic way. Well, I'll share a little bit of that here in a moment, but Beethoven in Havana sparked an international journey for him, which led to other projects of his, including Via Havana and Caribbean Nocturnes, and most recently, a project called Afro-Bach, which I'll preview a little bit for you at the tail end of the conversations. But through these recordings, through these performances, Joachim masterfully fuses foundational classical frameworks with the complex Afro-Caribbean and African rhythms that give this Western classical music a little flavor, a little spice. And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course if you don't know him, but what's really phenomenal for me to know is that his artistry, Joachim's artistry, doesn't stop as a performer. He's also a really incredible composer who's really made a name for himself in the commercial music world. He's scored over 60 film and television projects, and is really someone who I'm honored to have featured on the show. So we talk about his career, his upbringing, his studies in Cuba, and lots in between. So hope you enjoyed this dialogue between myself and Joachim Horsley. To get into our dialogue, here's a little preview of Beethoven in Havana, just to give you a taste of what he brings to the table. More from me on the other side. Again, enjoy our conversation.
Classical music, I think historically has been the elite music, right? And then the music that I love from the Caribbean has been the folkloric music that in some cases literally came from the lowest rung of society. When you talk about Afro-Cuban music, ex-slaves, slavery ended in 1890 in Cuba, and rumba started, which is one of my favorite rhythms in the whole world. Rumba started basically from the ex-slaves working in the shipyards in Cuba and making these incredible, basically party and social rhythms. When they would live in these solars, these 30-person, housing complexes, I guess you could say, or buildings, and then there would be a courtyard, and they do rumba in the neighborhood. It was the neighborhood music, and even at the time in Cuba, it was considered like very low music. They were doing. Still, the high class music was the danzón in Cuba. The high, that was I think at the time, though. though the history is a little foggy for me. But I do know that rumba, when it was came out, was the lowest kind of music there. Of course, it's considered a national treasure. It's actually the same story in a lot of ways. It's kind of the same story as hip hop in the United States. It's the same story as amapiano music coming from South Africa.
Mm.
Kind of started. This is like party music of the everyday people. And in all cases, what happens is this music generally has, historically, we see it start out as kind of this, music of the people, and the elites kind of look down on it, right? I mean, generally speaking. Now, the classical music has always been, more or less, the high class music. It wasn't always the music divorced of the everyday people, but I think after World War II, that's definitely what happened. You had more kind of like a real break from the art music and the popular music. I mean, you could kind of make an argument that Mozart, when he did Magic Flute, that was kind of like the equivalent of like Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat now.
Sure,
You know what I
sure.
mean? Like it was definitely more like a musical than a the super high end thing. But I think we all have a sense generally that there's stratifications of music. And I grew up playing classical music, but I love playing jazz. I love playing world music. I remember my dad, who liked Paul Simon, and he played me Paul Simon Graceland record. This is like the first African music I ever heard. It's so
Hmm.
funny to think that, because he was really into Paul Simon. I was just all about everyone else playing on the record. I mean, and that's what got me to be like, oh, I got to explore this music. And I found Caribbean music, and that's how, like, an American guy from the suburbs of Boston, got really like, oh, there's a lot out there that I really need to explore. And the cool thing was, my dad and my mom definitely saw that I was interested in exploring music, and they really encouraged me. They're like, you gotta get out of this scene, get out of, like, our this life. This is you're interested in other things. So I was really encouraged to keep looking. And I did discover, as I studied more music, that essentially classical music and everything else was somehow on this different level, and I thought it was absurd.
Hmm.
And that has really, I think, softened to a large degree. People are less guarded about that, and I think even classical musicians lament this. I mean, most musicians I know aren't the ones keeping up the walls, and I think that's actually a really cool thing to say. Like, it's
Yeah.
it's not the musicians themselves in the orchestra, it's not the musicians, it's not the Cuban musicians, these guys. Everyone I've interacted with, has always been really welcoming me. I've never felt like someone said, oh, this music isn't for you, or this music, and I think that's amazing. I remember Quincy Jones once said, like, if music if musicians ran the world, then racism would be over. And I think it's because all of us kind of, like, we know we takes all kinds, and we like all things. So I think it's really, it is. I have this little bee in my bonnet about being anti-elitist. You know what I mean? I want people. I love Mahler. I love Beethoven. I love the drama of classical music, and to me, Cuban music in particular from the Caribbean is so beautiful and complicated, and the orchestration principles in Cuban music have helped me be a better orchestrator for film and TV. And so, I mean, no music is the best, but I'm so inspired by what I keep learning about music from the Caribbean, and Afro-Caribbean music, and Brazilian music, and African music. It's like that dream we all have, that there's another room in the house that we never knew we had.
Hmm.
Every day, that's what it's like, and it's really humbling, because I think I know what I'm doing, and then all of a sudden I realize, oh my God, there's so much more to learn. But that's what life is, isn't it? So this is me saying, I'm really glad that. Oh, did my speaker change? Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries, no worries. It sounds
Yeah,
better now, actually.
it sounds better. Okay, yeah, I guess the AirPod wasn't so good. All right, I'll repeat that. I hope you don't mind. So, um, but anyway, what I wanted to say was really, at the end of the day, I love the idea of taking music that's supposed to be opposite, and pushing them together. And if you'll indulge me, I want to say one more thing about that I think is really, really fascinating. When
Sure.
you look at the history of classical music, in Europe, you have this idea that it came from the Christian church, right? It was monks and then choral music, and the priorities were melodies and harmonies because God is up in heaven, right? And the melodies are reaching up to God. You know, you can think of Mozart's Lacrimosa, right? And, you know, we
Hmm.
all know that famous piece, and the harmonies support a melody reaching up to God over here. On the other hand, when you look at Afro-Cuban music, especially the stuff, the Santeria stuff that has Yoruba roots, and that religion's a combination. It's basically Yoruba religion masked with Catholic saints. So it really is an African thing. And their gods are in the ocean and the ground. And so dancing and improvisation on a low drum is a priority. So when you mix these two kinds of music together, you're dealing with two kind of existential perspectives, right? Gods in the earth and the ocean. You're going to think about life a lot differently than God up in heaven in the clouds. And I find that so fascinating because the music is constructed with totally different principles. Also, I think it's really interesting that when I don't want to put too much on the religious thing because there's a lot of influences in classical music and, of course, the Caribbean music. It's not all religious based, but really just looking at the roots, I find it fascinating that, the Bible is a story, same way it has a beginning and a definite end, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of let's take Yoruba, right? Those gods are forever. And a lot of the music oriented around that, it isn't like you go to a concert of traditional Afro-Cuban music and you're really experiencing the same kind of beginning, climax, and ending. It's really more about a circle. It's almost like the way I see it is that the music is for them is always happening. And when you're playing the music, you're participating in this infinite circle or this thing that's really never beginning or ending. And I find that so interesting, right? Because we spend so much time in this linear world. I'm here in the United States, so I spend so much time in this Western linear world. And so much of what comes from Africa and everything in the Caribbean, all the Afro-Caribbean things, the principle is really more about it's a forever experience, however you want to look at it, a circle, eternal. And I find that absolutely so interesting. So when you're combining this music together, I think you really have to respect that you're combining these entirely cultural perspectives that are kind of opposite and as an arranger, you're craving contrast, right? You want to
Hmm.
get dynamic contrast. And now you have this like supposedly cultural contrast. I say that because truthfully, we could also talk about how humans all over the world aren't that different, right? But in this case, you have these different cultures and this different perspective on existence. And I find that fascinating. And to me, thinking about that when I'm working on the music is the part that really excites me.
What I'm really appreciating from this conversation already is the degree to which you have really embraced the culture, not just this aesthetic, this musical
Yes,
aesthetic, but the stories and just everything that surrounds it. Considering the work that you've done to really understand everything that surrounds the aesthetic, it's my sense that you could very easily have focused squarely on the rumba and all of
right,
this music.
right.
Why the dialectical, I'll use that word, approach?
Yeah.
Like, why even keep one arm on the quote unquote classical side of things?
Well, it's a great question. So, one of my heroes growing up was Henry Mancini, the film composer Henry Mancini. And like a lot of musicians in the 50s and 60s, when a lot of Cuban immigrants came to New York and salsa music kind of became a phenomenon, Latin music was really hot. And if you listen to his film scores, like Mr. Lucky and Peter Gunn and all the stuff he was doing in his time, Hollywood had like this Latin flavor, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't exactly Latin music, but it was like American film score with a touch of basically congas and bongos and kind of like stuff that had come in through this new wave of music. What happened in that situation from a musical perspective, and these scores are their own kind of history, but it was missing some of the roots of the music. When you study Afro-Cuban music, very important thing you learn is clave. Clave is like the spine of the music. It's like
Hmm.
this rhythm that is explicit in Cuban music and implied in other styles of Caribbean music, and we can talk about that. But for example, I think really when he was doing his arrangements, he used Latin flavor and it was kind of divorced from the clave. So it was a little bit like,
like taking the branches of the tree without the roots, right? And when you study music, jazz in America, at some point you recognize that, especially because we often study from this book called The Real Book, which is a
Yep.
collection of all these American tunes. You know it, right? And as if you know it, the tunes in the Real Book, they either say Latin or swing, right? These are
Hmm.
the two big categories. So obviously that's really broad. And you start playing and you start realizing the bass players don't necessarily know the difference between a bossa nova bass line and like a Son Montuno bass line, right? And I found myself really being a little bit lost, having this kind of like this American point of view education. Like we're looking at it like swing, oh, but this is Latin, but we're not really understanding the roots of what's going on. So I realized that I wasn't going to get very far unless I got serious about understanding the roots of what's going on. And of course, that puts you down this rabbit hole that like you'll never get to the bottom of because there's so much incredible music. And then you learn about how indigenous music got mixed in Colombia and Venezuela, for example, and how, it's just it's like a studying music, it becomes this amazing history. And especially when you're studying the folkloric stuff, it's all the history that was just the small paragraphs in my American history book. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Like the Haitian Revolution was a huge deal for the United States and music and everything else. And when I was studying it growing up, it was like all about how Jefferson, made this great deal and got a fire sale of land from Napoleon. And that never would have happened if the Haitians hadn't basically overthrown their slave owners, which is a massively historical event. And it scared the crap out of all the colonialists. And that's when slavery in the US got so brutal. And all of this affected the music, all of because of the immigration. And you have Haitians coming to New Orleans and Cuba and mixing things around. And it's really fascinating. So the music we're left over is like a mirror from our history. And when you learn about the music, you have to learn about the history. And I find that so amazing to put it all together. And well, essentially, I guess what it comes down to is I realized how important it was to learn everything properly. And, especially also because I'm not from the Caribbean, it would be quite a lame thing to do to like get into this music and kind of get the flavor, but not the real deep feel. And discovering the feel of music with kind of a classical drama is where it's at for me. So like I really love having like the drama of 19th century classical music with the rhythm and sophistication of the rhythm from the Caribbean in various styles. And pulling that off, I think, requires kind of a certain attention to detail, which often requires me figuring out how to do things that I just don't know how to do, like everything from how I play, like what's the exact feel of what I play, what's the instrumentation, and so forth. So I think the exciting part for me is really just kind of like putting myself in this situation where I just am constantly learning and pushing myself to really understand things. And I think is and in the process, I've fallen in love with the different kinds of roots of everything and just really understanding the difference between how, let's say, Dominicans, Cubans, and Colombians understand and interpret music
Hmm.
is so fascinating to me because yes, there's a lot of similarities in the rhythms if you were to write them down. But the interesting part is the different kind of, you could say almost like different personalities and accents that come in these different kinds of Afro culture and rhythms. And in my show, it's my job to kind of be able to sort of dance between all these things. And me and my musicians who are all Caribbean players, and I'm the classical guy. We're always trying to figure out this delicate balance to do the fusion justice. So
Yeah.
all that is stuff that really excites me in my project.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you about the nuance of these different
Yeah.
languages, these quote unquote
Yeah.
flavors. But when I think
Mhm.
about the fusion aspect, again, going down this pathway of going deeper than the aesthetic, I think about the way that the music is communicated, translated, realized, the way it's learned. As a
Mhm.
classically trained musician, we all, I feel like, are trained to treat the page as the authority. That is the standard.
Right.
But my sense
Right.
is that in what you do, the feel is the authority. What you know,
Yeah,
there's something more than just doing it correctly. There's it's
right.
deeper than that. I wonder if you could speak to that aspect again when it comes to this fusion. How do you sit accuracy next to making sure the feeling is right, even if a note is dropped
Yeah.
here or there or whatever?
Great. So I think in all styles of music, yes, classical music too, the great players, they make a really uh, direct and deliberate decision about the feel that they're going to play with. So, for example, waltz in Vienna is played a very certain way. There's a feel to it that you can't quite get if you're just reading the music. There's a vibe, there's a feel,
Mm-hmm.
there's a way they dance to that stuff. And of course, Cuban music, there's a way it feels when you're looking at everything. You could write it all down, but unless you're really hearing how it's done, you're not going to get the right kind of flavor. So you have to be listening to how the people did it before. And then, I'm making a fusion project. So in the way I kind of have the license to sort of do it my own way. And some people who come from the classical world who kind of do let's say classical meets Cuba, you can tell the way they're thinking about it, you can feel kind of like classically proper with a touch of Cuban rhythms. That's great. I'm trying to do something a little different. I'm trying to do something that's a little bit more raw. And I think what it comes from is in 2015 when I went to Cuba for the first time. I had studied Latin music my whole life, but I hadn't been to Cuba. So this is like studying painting and then going to hang out with Renoir for a
Right.
week, right? So I hadn't really known timba music that much, and that's kind of like timba is like modern salsa music for those who don't know. Good bands like Timba Live, and of course, there's bands all over the world that are playing this kind of music. Havana de Primera is a huge timba band, and Alain Perez. These are like big Cuban artists that are doing timba music. But the thing about timba music, it's like all the amazing phenomenons in culture of music and funk and salsa come down into this timba. But what is really interesting is when I went to Cuba, I saw an energy that I had never seen, and I mean like a real kind of like playing that was just not only so energetic but so passionate and like nothing I'd ever seen. It absolutely blew me away. It was one of those moments where like you're really like, oh my God, I have two lives, and the second one starts the moment you realize you only have one. And I'm like, I gotta do this fusion project because if I can do my music and do the kind of over the top sort of arrangements with this kind of energy, that to me was where it was at. I had gone to Cuba thinking I would do kind of like this Beethoven mambo project, but after talking to the timba musicians, they were like basically they were like, you don't have to be so behaved, man.
Hmm.
Like do something a little more intense, and they inspired me to kind of step it up. And I came back like to the U.S. and I had sort of like this mission to really try to do things that I thought would have the energy that I was looking for, but kind of the beautiful melodies and harmonies of classical music. So I tried this piece called Beethoven in Havana, and I didn't have a band at the time, so it was like my trial balloon for the whole thing. And I just made a video where I just transcribed rumba rhythms and played it all on the inside of the piano and did this arrangement of Beethoven. And fortunately, people thought it was worth listening to, and it started to get a little traction. And I ended up, starting to tour in France and in the U.S. a little bit, and it's been great ever since. And that's really kicked it off. And once I realized that people like that, I was like, okay, great, like I must be onto something. So I just kind of kept going. And I think what I'm always trying to go for is that over the top energy and passion that I see with the Cuban musicians and other Caribbean musicians in general. And, there's a certain fire that doesn't exist when you play classical music exactly. But I feel like the best classical music has the kind of passion that a lot of the 19th century romantic stuff, like that we see in Rachmaninoff and even Chopin, it's very dramatic and passionate. And I think combined with the kind of different passion I see in Cuba is kind of what I'm always shooting for,
Hmm.
if it makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't want this project to be polite. I want it to be really, really wonderful and passionate. I want to feel dramatic, like you're biking on the edge of a cliff most of the time, and then it turns and all that stuff that we like as arrangers. I feel like the Cuban format gives me the kind of structure to create that kind of drama. And of course, I'm always going for that energy that I felt in Havana in 2015.
So as you talk about rumba, timba, all of these different aesthetics and histories, how do you
Mhm.
reconcile the fact that most Americans just hear Latin music, quote
Yeah.
unquote? I wonder how you deal with the fact that there are different things that you're engaging. Is there a way of communicating that to audiences who may not understand those nuances?
Right. So yeah, we're always dealing with that. Even in the news, when they say, they talk about Latin people as one thing, and the news talks about, well, like especially when politics, like the vote, the Latin vote, the black vote, the
Sure.
white vote. It's like these things are, and of course, like it's like these things are so broad. And I think the thing about Latin music and is that if the Americans kind of see it as the other thing coming from the South, okay. So, but when you really start to see the differences and learn the nuances of all this, it's so rewarding. I mean, it's like, it's just like going to the gardening store and thinking everything's peonies. You know what I mean? Come
Yeah.
on, like there's so much flavor out there, and it's humbling because you think you know one thing, and then you learn that you're completely wrong all the time. It happens to me all the time. And I actually love it because, the whole learning of all this is really the joy for me. And so I think one thing that I think is great, Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl did all us Caribbean music fans a huge service because I thought when he paraded out the flags during that moment, that was like a really, really great moment because he really sent a signal that I think a lot of us want, which is like we have all these wonderful roots and flavors and history, and it's all the Americas, and we have so much to celebrate and so much to look at. I think our lives are endlessly enriched when we explore. We explore all these different things, and I hope that to some degree, I hope that when people hear my music and there's a classical famous melody that's familiar, but a rhythm that's a little different, it's a nice little kind of segue for someone who's unfamiliar with the music to go like, oh, this is kind of neat. Kind of the same experience I had with Paul Simon when I was a kid. Like he was singing songs. He was an artist that my dad liked. And but I heard African choirs and African rhythms, and it blew my mind. And I want people to have that same kind of like experience that I had.
Hmm.
I have it all the time, and it's like just talking about it with you, it makes me feel like I'm like coming out of a meth lab. Like it's so exciting to me, and I think that's where it's at. That's what I hope. That's what I try to bring on stage, and that's what I hope. That's the kind of thing I hope inspires people.
Something that came to mind as I was listening to your music in preparation for this conversation, when I hear the way that you play the piano in these contexts, it doesn't sound completely foreign, or it doesn't sound like the piano is an instrument that doesn't belong in these spaces any more
Yeah.
than if I listen to a jazz quartet and there's a piano. The piano
Right.
feels like it's a part of this tradition. It's not something that's been superimposed. I wonder if you could talk a
Yeah.
little bit about the historical relationship between rumba and the instrument of the piano.
Sure. So traditional rumba music, end of 19th century, when slavery ended, like we talked about, these folks went to the shipyards and they basically took barrels and wood, and that became the instruments that they used after work at
Hmm.
home. And so it was vocal and drums, and that's it. And the different formats evolved, but eventually what happened is these rhythms, like specifically rumba guaguancó and rumba yambu and rumba colombia, these rhythms got built into eventually, well, depends on how you look at it. They got built into the salsa world, sure, and they got built into the timba world eventually, and they became more than just vocal and percussion music. Eventually, with guys who made mambo, which is a whole history that I couldn't dare try to tell. But there's a lot of like who invented the mambo, which I can't even get into that because it's a big controversial discussion. But eventually, rumba rhythms were built into other kinds of Cuban music, and it just became one of the many beautiful tapestries that came into salsa and other forms of Latin music as it evolved. Now, keep in mind, salsa music, just to be clear for our audience, during the wave of immigration of Cubans coming to New York and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, it was this phenomenon that happened in New York with Fania Records, and salsa is more like a whole movement that basically they're playing Cuban rhythms, but it's Puerto Ricans and Cubans and some Dominicans playing Cuban music. And you get guys like Ray Barretto and, of course, Celia Cruz and all the greats. But salsa was kind of this phenomenon of New York that took Caribbean things and kind of was its own little evolution. And then salsa went back to Cuba, and all these things kind of mixed together. Piano was always there in some way in salsa music. And one particular flavor is this thing called tumbao or montuno, which is that piano pattern. Bonki, gonki, 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 gonki. We always see that, and that's an important part of the danceability of all salsa music and Cuban music, which again is the roots of the salsa music. So when I adapt these rhythms of classical pieces, I'm thinking about the rhythm of the clave and the tumbao. And so sometimes I'm changing the rhythm of the melodies. Like, on my latest album, Afro Bach, we just basically took a lot of Bach, and even in the fugal works, we just adjusted the rhythms to fit. It's Bach, but with rhythms adjusted to fit with the dance rhythms of Cuba. And that's because of the rules that come kind of when you do the orchestration, and the rules are just there to make sure it stays danceable, right? So that's kind of an important thing to say, actually, because when you learn this music in the United States, they're very clear to be like, these are the rules, you have to respect the music. And then when you talk to Cubans about it, be like, yeah, those are the rules so that everybody keeps dancing. And we forget that dance music, and you can kind of break the rules as long as people keep dancing if you intended to make dance music. But if you break the rules and you're making like a concert piece and you're kind of showcasing it and people start to sit down and that's okay with you, then I guess it's okay. But the point is people kind of forget that the whole reason these rules exist about how to play Latin music is to keep people dancing. And so that's kind of it. So basically what it is like, I'm making dance music out of classical music, and I'm adjusting the rhythms to conform so that someone could dance the whole song through in a certain way, and they wouldn't feel like there was a change. You know what I mean? And like, it's almost like you could test the music with a dancer. We did a Bach fugue in cumbia, right? And if I played that for my friend who dances cumbia, if they stopped dancing, I know I did something wrong. And that's kind of like the big test, right? So there's lots of rules about where to put the accents and so forth. But at the end of the day, what really matters is that if you're making dance music, you got to keep the people dancing. And that's kind of the big general rule. So, but it's a fun game, right? I've created this puzzle of like, hey, let's adapt classical music into these dance rhythms and see if it'll work. Now, the things you've heard on my records are the things that basically worked. There's a lot of things I've tried that I got halfway through and I'm like, I'm not feeling it, because what I call is like the curse of the X Games. Remember the X Games? It was like football meets pro wrestling, and it didn't work because it was like the worst of football and the worst of pro wrestling. And when it came together, it wasn't like the best of football and the best of pro wrestling. Sure. So when you make fusion, a lot of times you have to be really careful and honest that you're taking the best of one thing, mixing it with the best of the other to make something that's also good. And, there are times when, a classical piece can have a really delicate, beautiful, passionate melody, and putting it with a certain rhythm, you don't feel that passionate melody anymore. And likewise, there are times when, the rhythm just isn't serving the piece in some way. And I have to experiment a lot. And the things that I release are the things, of course, that I think kind of worked, from my point of view. And then sometimes there are times when it's just like I've tried something in a Cuban rhythm, and then I come back 2 years later and I realize I should have done a totally different rhythm from a different country to make it more interesting. But anyway, to me, it's like, I think if people can hear this music and experience it in a different way than they heard the original, whether it's the original classical piece or let's say it's the original rhythm, the root rhythm in there, I think that's a nice way to reappreciate the music and reappreciate the rhythm. So hopefully, again, everyone's experiencing that moment that I try to have with this music.
Hmm.
Yeah.
When I think about meshing the best with the best, I can imagine that in a concert setting, maybe in the United States, if I'm hearing this really famous Bach fugue made in a danceable way, the novelty, at least to our ears, is, oh wow, listen to how this is, sort of been put on its head. I think
Yeah.
conversely,
Yeah.
I assume, or I sense that if it's danceable for people in Cuba or folks who, have a deeper engagement with that culture, it doesn't so
Uh-huh.
much matter what the melody is. Do you feel like the novelty translates on both sides in the way that you're looking for?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we do it right, the novelty translates on both sides, and yeah, I absolutely think so. I think what's also kind of nice is there's a certain subconscious satisfaction that everybody feels when we can pull this off. It's like um, because at least for me, I feel like if we kind of the subtext of all this is, we're not all that different. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
and I like when it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, this Beethoven thing totally works with this rumba rhythm. Come on. And it's like I feel that sort of sends a like we're all kind of one species kind of message, which I really love, and it's what I feel all the time with my musician friends. When I meet people like gosh, I work with these two amazing Colombian musicians, Jen Del Tambo and Orito Cantora. They actually played on that Bach fugue on my latest album. They did all the percussion, and they play with so much passion, and they're such different musicians than I am. And I just like, they're like my sisters. I love them so much, and I've learned so much just hearing how they interpret things. The way they play, it's not always straight, it's not always swung, it's just this whole different thing. And it is like learning a whole new language. And just to continue that metaphor, what I've realized is that, just like if me learning Spanish, not being a native Spanish speaker, I will always have an accent, and I'm okay with
Hmm.
that. But people with an accent can still make poetry in that language they've learned, And so it's just sort of being like okay with where you are, okay with where the journey is. Because a lot of times I'm like, oh my God, man, I can't play like the Colombians, I can't play like the Cubans, and I get in my own head. But then I'm like, okay, I don't have to. Like, what I need to do is go on my own journey and learn and say something new. And that's what I go for, I guess, with them. And I think what I love and appreciate with them, and I hope that's what they appreciate with me, is that we kind of find this new thing that we put together with these, coming from these different worlds, so to speak. Yeah, so we're experiencing our differences and our similarities all at once, and it's like sometimes a super profound emotional experience just to work with them. So that's where it's at for me, I guess.
When you made it to Cuba in 2015, I'm curious, were you able to get a sense of how the Western classical in its straight form was engaged there? Did you make it to an orchestra concert? Was
Yeah.
that even a thing you did?
Yeah, 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 actually. And then I went back to in 2019 and I played some of my music with the National Orchestra of Cuba. And we had an amazing concert. Well, certainly in Cuba, there's also a very strong tradition of learning classical music. They have a great conservatory for music, also for dance and there's so much art in Cuba. And what's interesting is uh, almost all the Cuban musicians have some experience with Bach. It's like,
Hmm.
and I would say that most musicians around the world have some experience with Bach and the big classical composers. And we all kind of relate to it. He's kind of ground zero for modern music, if you think about it.
Sure.
And yeah, so of course there's a whole classical tradition in Cuba. Many they get great training there. They have gotten, obviously the recent history of Cuba is really really complicated, and there's a lot of things that are really in trouble right now. So I don't know how it is in the last few years, but yes, there's been a tradition of having a lot of amazing amazing training in the classical world by Cuban musicians, and you see those folks playing in orchestras all over the world too. So.
There must have been a lot of logistical hoops for you to jump through to even get there in the first place. I always thought of Cuba as this place we just can't go.
Yeah, generally that's the case. I studied with a Canadian who had a workshop. His name was Aldo Maza, and he had a workshop called Cosa Music. And I signed up with him because he was a friend of a friend, and basically he can take Americans there with a simple affidavit, and you have to get a license. And it's at least at the time it wasn't too complicated. So I haven't been back since 2019, and I do worry about Cuba. I worry about its future, and I think we're all worried. All of us who love the people and love the music are hope that there's a positive future for the island.
Yeah, I wonder, speaking of the people, I wonder if you could just paint the picture of experiencing rumba in Cuba in the wild for the first time. I mean, you had to have been wide-eyed. What happened that night?
Oh my God. So I was there a week and I was doing workshops, like studying with percussionists. And at night we would go to festivals. And I think my last night there, I saw a festival with some huge, huge artists, some of which who, aren't here anymore. But what it was is I was seeing dance and energy that was just such unbelievable. It felt like this unbridled passion. And Cubans kind of know what this is when I'm mentioning it, and people who've experienced it. But it's a combination of passion, energy, and attitude that
Hmm.
I think doesn't even exist when Cubans leave the island unless they really, really work to maintain it. It's almost like the U.S. It just if we're not careful, I think it can kind of round the edges on us, and like this is not just saying about foreigners coming here like losing their edges. That's not what I mean. What I mean, all of us, like commercial music. I mean, we live in a really commercial music world, and I feel like it's our job as musicians to try to always sharpen the sword. It's real easy to kind of like just hear what's happening in the pop world and just hear that like it's safe music, you know what I'm saying? And I think we try to imitate that at our peril. Like if we try to be successful by also making more safe music, it just doesn't really work. This is something we talk about a lot with musicians. Everything from how we edit our music to how we perform it to how we sing to being correct to
Hmm.
that vocal mistake that you keep. All of that is a decision you make because I think you're fighting to have this like honest thing out there, this honest passion. And I guess maybe that's what I would say is what I was looking at in Cuba. It felt so authentic and real. And at the time it was 2015. I'd been out in Hollywood for a little while and doing film score, and honestly at the time I was a little sad in my like film score experience because I felt like there was such a pressure to make this like commercial music that kind of sort of sounded like, an edgeless version of Hans Zimmer. That's like what
Hmm.
everything was, man. And I was so over it. And going back to Cuba, it was like a 180. It was because this was the most authentic thing. And I was living in a place where it felt like everybody was faking it. You know what I'm saying? And so I still think about this all the time. And musicians, we talk about this all the time. It's like, how do you like when we say we want to keep it real and make something really, really authentic, it's this nebulous sense that an artist is really putting their heart out there. And I think when the audience hears that, they know it. They know it. And they tell their friends about it. They're like, this is the new thing. It's really great. Whatever genre of music is, whether it's a classical performance or a new classical piece or Latin music or pop, rock, jazz, whatever, if it's passion and the audience can tell. And so I guess that was my big lesson is like, this was a real passionate place. And if I can preserve that in my music, in my own way and really be honest and passionate, then I think it'll be a success. And so that's how I think of it.
So if I have the timeline correct, when you made your way down to Cuba for the first time, you were already doing your thing in Hollywood and film
Yeah.
scoring. Well, what was
That's
your end? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, so when I graduated college in 2000, I kicked around Boston for a bit, but ended up in 2003 or so, 2002, at a jingle house in New York, working for a guy named Rob Kahn. He had a small jingle house, and I basically ran Pro Tools for him and took out the trash as a first job in music. And then at night he would let me write my own demos on some of the open calls for like a McDonald's commercial or a soap commercial, something like that. And I would write sometimes very bad demos and just like put them in the pile. And eventually one or two of them worked, and I started freelancing for him. And then I started looking for independent filmmakers, student filmmakers at NYU and Columbia, short films and things like that. And then a lot with Columbia. Then my wife actually went to Columbia Film School, so I met even more film students that way. And by the time I got to 2009, I did an ASCAP workshop out for composers out in Los Angeles. And my wife and I drove across the country. She happened to be about 6 weeks pregnant with our son Desmond, who's now 15, 16. Oh my God, 16. And then and I just started working as an orchestrator. I had met some people at film festivals who had urged me to come to LA, and I just basically picked up the phone and started calling other composers to see if I could work for them in any way, Pro Tools, orchestration, additional music, whatever. And 2015, I didn't really have my own like big project TV show. I was doing a lot of independent films. And then eventually I got on this show a few years after I got back from Cuba called Big City Greens, which is this really great Disney Channel show that I've been working on. And we're now in season 5. And it's a wonderful family show on the Disney Channel. And I've done other things for, other TV shows. And so half my life is writing music for film and TV, and half my life is being this crazy fusion guy with piano and Caribbean rhythms and classical music. So
do you like that what sounds like daytime gig, nighttime gig? Like do you like that double life? Would you love to fall completely onto the rumba side of things one day?
Well, sometimes I resent one or the other because I'm tired, but I've come to realize that I have a really good life, and I'm Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? I get to have this wonderful job in film scoring, and the people I work with are amazing and delightful, and I learn things, and I'm writing tons of music, and then arranging and writing music for the Via Havana project, which became Afro-Bach, and the next album will be called Super Fusion. That's the one I'm working on now. I need both to work and live and be happy, and I think that I think I would be a little sad if I didn't have one or the other in different ways. And sometimes I fantasize about, touring the world and just doing, touring with my band. Of course, I'd like to try that for a period of time. But if I gave up film and TV, I'd feel something was really missing. That's a lovely thing. And of course, if I didn't get to perform, I would feel just as frustrated as I did before I went to Cuba in 2015. So I think both really feed a different part of my artistic desire. And honestly, as long as I always have my project, when you work in film and TV, you're like a private dancer, right? Like you get to make music for other people, and it's their show. You're in service of a film, and that's very different than making your own album or record, because you can't. It's actually dangerous if you start writing with your own ego for film and TV. It usually fails. It always has to be about what's going on in the story. That's very, very important. And so they need somebody who can really commit to their vision. And I think if I didn't have an outlet for my vision, I think I'd be a frustrated artist, honestly. And so I think that's how I get through. And I've just kind of learned to love both, drink coffee, get it done.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, my sense is that what you're describing is also true for composers who are just taking an orchestral commission. While there is that creative license, the artistic director at X orchestra and X state does have a general sense of what they want it to be. So I think that's an important thing to note for composers generally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also important to remember for everybody who's trying to figure out how their music career works is that Charlie Parker played bar mitzvahs. I mean, we don't remember him as the great bar mitzvah saxophone player, but he needed to pay his rent just like everybody else when he was, not getting paid for his amazing music.
Yeah. Philip Glass worked for a moving company, Light Moving,
is that right?
which eventually became the name of a piece, Light Moving. But
oh my God, maybe that's why he got into minimalism, because he's just doing this like repetitive moving task the whole time.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
I didn't know that. That's an interesting fact.
Yeah, indeed. So one of the other things I was thinking about, as we start to wrap up here, is this idea of this classical training being a prerequisite to broader creativity. You've even noted that many of the folks down in Cuba have that connection to Bach. I wonder what your thoughts thoughts are on how we can systematically create more musicians who have a wider range of skill sets and abilities on their respective instruments? Does it all just start with learning those scales, learning this classical music, and then you can branch off? Or is there a world in which from the beginning there's a broader engagement that just, creates a wider tree trunk, so to speak, as the musician develops over the years?
Right. It's a great question. I don't have the answer, but I think that everyone who teaches music is trying to figure out how to balance fun and excitement and rigor all at once. Of course, classical music is famous for its rigorous structures, right? Learning how to play technically correctly. So all of that's super valuable. You need it. You also need to be dancing and having fun and being creative and play. And I read a study recently that said that when they took toddlers who are in sort of a free play mode, as opposed to giving very specific instructions on how to do things, that the ones who were in free play mode had more brain activity, they learned quicker, they were more dynamic. And the takeaway from the study, as far as I knew, was that free play is actually a lot more long-term meaningful for the development of the brain. And I think that has been my experience, that having as much time to free play is really, really important. But if you don't have the rigor and you don't have the time, there's no shortcut. You have to play scales, you have to play with a metronome, or you have to learn how to sit in a pocket. Whatever style of music it is, you have to be steady and you have to work on that technique. There's just no skipping it. So I think there's many ways around the block, and everyone's going to talk about different ways to do it. But I think that there has to be some good mix of rigor, play, excitement, discipline, and joy in every aspect of learning music, and maybe learning everything.
And then even on the audience side, we kind of touched on this earlier about the novelty translating on both sides. But I can't, and maybe this is just because I'm grumpy about classical music sometimes. It feels like there's more benefit for an orchestra to present something different, quote unquote, than there is for folks who go to a Roomba club to hear something different. It feels like the relevance piece benefits classical more than the other side. I wonder if you share that perspective or have a different view on it.
No, that's really interesting. Tell me a little further about what you think, because I want to really understand what you mean.
I don't think I sense folks who enjoy Roomba needing to uphold, to save, to really nurture those infrastructures in the same way that we're always working on making sure classical music is more relevant. We're getting younger audiences. I don't think I see that struggle on both sides of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I get it. Okay. So yes, classical music is always feeling like its audience is getting smaller and dying off right now. And we've seen that a lot. And I think they're always looking for creative ways to freshen things up. And I believe that part of that is because after World War II, that was really, well, World War I and World War II, we really did have a split of this is the high-end art music. This is the pop music. That's really, we always think is pop music and classical music as being different, but it wasn't always the case. Sometime around the beginning of the 20th century, things got really broke out. And then of course you had this experience at the concert hall where you had, basically avant-garde music, the stuff that was after Stravinsky, every composer felt this real pressure to start a revolution with their music. And I think they isolated audiences more and more and more. So now you get this weird thing where you have Beethoven and Mozart in the concert and also a premiere piece by a 2026 artist, which is going to feel different. And, sometimes it's amazing, but a lot of times it's just this thing that nobody has any context for and it feels non-tonal. And I think the audiences just are bored and they don't want to say it, but they're just bored. And now those are not the only two options in this, what I do when I come play with an orchestra is, we're bringing these arrangements of Beethoven. So, what I do is a third solution for the concert hall. We have a little bit of the tradition. We have something new. We have a little fun. I think that's the way to go. I think there's lots of different ways to keep it fresh. But what I think is most important that for classical music that feels scared about the audience going away is just listen to what the community wants. If there's a lot of people who like Latin music, well, program all this amazing Latin stuff with orchestra, for example. I mean, that's something I do, but there's so many different ways to do it. And also, there's exciting classical composers right now. Gabrielle Ortiz, who just won
Hmm.
Grammys, Latin Grammys, and regular Grammys, she's amazing. And I think she's the most exciting composer, like modern composer I've heard in a long time. She might be the best. And what she's doing is incredible. And there's a lot of people doing really exciting stuff. I think being really attentive and passionate and supportive and connecting with the community is really, really important. And moreover, it's like I also think there's a little bit of this fear that if we don't do Beethoven, it will die. And I don't know where that comes from. I mean, Beethoven's been around for 300 years because people continue to love it. And I don't think people will stop doing it, and doing it a little bit differently is okay. But the legit repertoire is, I feel it has more staying power than sometimes our fears give it credit for. And I think it's never going away. I mean, if it's lasted 300 years, we're not going to kill it this generation. We're just not. And then I think when it comes to the Caribbean music, to some degree, the rumba and rumba actually is getting a little bit threatened. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not, how should I say threatened? Like, look, reggaeton music's amazing and it's really, really popular. And when you go to visit Cuba, or let's say that's complicated right now, but when you say go to visit the DR, how much authentic merengue are you going to hear versus reggaeton or the pop stuff that you're hearing in the resorts and things like that? And so I think those musicians are worried that their traditions are getting lost because pop music is what people are listening to. And, oftentimes, I think this is one of the fears about Puerto Rico becoming a state, for example. Like a lot of folks really don't want that to happen. And I do respect that opinion because they're afraid that the Puerto Rican music, the traditional stuff, and the Puerto Rican culture will kind of go away because it'll just be Starbucks vibes. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying? And I think that's a really important thing. I mean, all the stuff that inspired me, it's not only my job to shake it up with classical music, it's my job to make sure that people really know that the root rhythms are amazing and they should be preserved and respected. Not like a museum, but something that you play with and interact with. If I could make a dream music festival, it would be a fusion festival where you had different kinds of music coming in all over the world, and there'd be like food as well from every different place, like Haitian food and Colombian food and all this stuff. And it would be a 2 week experience in every city in the United States, and everybody would have a chance to like, it would be like free to the public, and everybody would go and experience all this music. And they would leave with, I think, a richer sense and pride in being human, and also just a little more of the scariness and gateway to these kinds of rhythms and arts that they don't know how to access. You know what I mean? One thing we talk about that I think is really interesting is rumba music's real complicated, right? But I think even Quincy Jones said this again. He's like, any music that you can put a four on the floor with,
Hmm.
it's gonna work in America, right? And we feel that like everything from disco. And so reggaeton, you can kind of do that. And even in reggaeton, you can put rumba and merengue and cumbia in reggaeton and it kind of works. So even though I've kind of mentioned that reggaeton can sort of be a threat, it's also an envelope or a container for a lot of the traditional stuff. So I see I never want to say that a music in general is a threat, because everything that feels like it's pushing out the traditional stuff also can be a boat to get the traditional stuff in the ears of people that would have never seen it coming, and will be delighted to enjoy it. So it's really interesting, right? Like music can come in different ways, and I feel like it'd be great if everybody was open to exploring everything, and if I can do a little bit to kind of put everyone together and be kind of a little bit of a tour guide or a diplomat to all this stuff, I'd be real happy.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, where I want to end, I want to take 2, 3 steps back from the whole conversation and just acknowledge, as I was preparing for this chat, I've found myself thinking about the word classical, the phrase classical music, in a way that goes against what I feel like I've been trying to build
Yeah.
for so many years. When I try to make a habit out of using that phrase to refer to a cultural tradition. There's Indian classical. There's
Hmm.
there's a
Yeah.
classical tradition across many Asian countries. When I think think of rumba, I would like to think of it as a classical music, as a form of music that is foundational to a culture. Do you see a world in which this label of classical, this phrase classical music, can genuinely reference anything connected to tradition, even if those traditions don't originate in Western Europe?
Right. So this is kind of the difference between the category at the record store or on the Spotify label versus what it really is. So classical music, when you're going on let's say iTunes or Spotify, it covers Baroque music, Renaissance music, 19th century music, 20th century art music. That's like hundreds of years of music. And also like with salsa music, that's actually it's a smaller category, but it's really a collection of Cuban music, and unfortunately, we got to deal with this. Like these labels are not specific, and you can get kind of pedantic if you're like, well, actually it's Baroque music, then and not everybody's feeling that. They're just like, come on, we don't have time for that. Let's just get to the good music. But I think as musicians, we got to do our best to really like let people know the differences. And when I'm in concert, I like to talk about the differences. I don't want to lecture in my shows, but I feel like if you give people, 10%, 50% context of what's going on, the music's better. You know what I mean? And I think people want to know the difference between Baroque music and, quote unquote classical era music that came afterwards. You know what I mean? I think it's important to make the distinction. And, for example, Beethoven gets his own chapter in a lot of music textbooks because he was the transition between the classical era and the romantic era. And he was also the transition between the musician kind of being a servant of the courts to being kind of a rock star. He was an innovator. He told dukes and famous people at the time to give him money and they would be immortalized because he would dedicate his first symphony. I mean, that's some entrepreneurial move right there, right? So and it's true, the guy's name is right at the beginning of the first symphony. Now, I don't remember his name. I remember the first symphony, but he got his name on something that was immortal. I mean, so that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to study these different eras. And when you're a musician, you see the difference between Bach and Strauss and Stravinsky dramatically. But I think for a lot of the general public, that's all the same people on the same radio station, right? So I don't know. I mean, I feel that it's important that we keep educating and keep talking about these things, try not to bore people, make it fun, and like take people on a journey. And I think it'll be okay.
That's the Tropical Prelude from Joachim's Afro Bach, one track on the really incredible album titled Afro Bach that you can check out wherever you listen to music, wherever you stream music. I also have a couple links in the description of this opus if you'd like to check that out. Huge thanks to Joachim Horsley for joining me, to his entire team for putting him on my radar. Congrats to everything he's doing. I really appreciate getting this perspective. It's one that I don't think I would have come to on my own. So really exciting stuff here. I hope you enjoyed that. So before I get into my triloquy, I will say it's almost 2 a.m. as I record this, and I'm as soon as I upload this, I'm gonna hop in the shower and hop on a plane because my life just is going and going and going, and I'm grateful for that. So just a bit of warning there if I'm incoherent here. But one thing I wanted to talk about, the thing I wanted to talk about in this triloquy was this notion again of cultural appropriation. And I know I touched on this maybe last opus or a couple opuses ago, but I wanted to return to it considering the conversation that I just had. So as you heard in my dialogue, Joachim, he served his country, so to speak. He really did his homework, spent time where rumba and all this music was born and really thrives, and has created for himself the license to really do what he's doing in a really phenomenal way. I think there are various degrees to which that kind of work is accepted, especially when it comes to Black music, which is now global. But when it comes to indigenous music, or music that we consider indigenous, the conversation can be a little nuanced. I think I mentioned a couple opuses ago that at the American Composers Forum, we invited up a group from Argentina to showcase their work, which highlights different indigenous musings and musicings across South America and Central America. There was a partner institution that was involved with it, and when they learned more about this organization and what they were doing, they sort of backed off, because they really didn't feel comfortable with the levels of appropriation, cultural appropriation, or what they considered cultural appropriation. And of course, as someone who is not indigenous, I have no room to make any judgments or to push back on anyone backing away from a project like that. But the more that I thought about it, and the more that I really tapped into my Buddhism and the spirit of dialogue, the more I felt like I needed to take more of a hands-on approach with this situation. And again, I won't name the ensemble because I don't want anything to be misconstrued, but I took the time to go check out one of the performances of this ensemble, even though they weren't getting the support from the organization that we partnered with to put on a show. They figured out how to put on a show on their own, and did, and there was a crowd. So I went, and I could definitely sense a little, or could sense why our partner institution was a little nervous to put this on. There were the use of masks from different indigenous practices, instruments, costumes that weren't representative of the people who were actually on stage. So I found myself a little bit uncomfortable, and I could have ended it there, but I decided to put my big boy pants on, to put my executive director pants on, and schedule a meeting with one of their leaders a couple weeks later, just to voice concerns and just to make sure everything was on the table. And the conversation kind of shifted my thinking around this conversation of cultural appropriation. Long story short, what was shared with me from this ensemble leader was that it's a part of indigenous practices for shamans and village elders to bestow on visitors the rights and the responsibilities to spread their culture and share their culture, that is largely disappearing. And I know that it's hard for, those of us who really do this work to accept the fact that cultures may actually disappear. It seems like there are always culture bearers who are there to carry the torch. But the reality is that isn't always the case, at least from what I've learned from this conversation from this Argentinian musician who goes around South America, learning about all these various indigenous practices. And I almost feel a little guilty talking about it here now, but I think it's so important because we make a lot of assumptions about what a person is bringing to the table without knowing what they have gone through, or who they have talked to, or who they have who they have gotten, for lack of a better term, the stamp of approval from, to move the work forward and to do what those village elders and village shamans feel like needs to be done. So all of this to say, I'm thinking about cultural appropriation and this whole idea differently these days. Is it really an audience's responsibility to call foul on a performer or on someone who's bringing culture forward if they don't really have confirmed facts and perspectives on what those artists have done to be on that stage? It seems like we assume the worst, and I feel the woke bones in me really grinding right now. But when I take that human-centered approach, again, turning these people who, it's so easy to villainize from one perspective, but really humanizing them and seeing the perspectives that they have and hearing them share their experiences on this art, it changes my perspective. I'll also add that this musician from this ensemble who I spoke to, completely spoke to the very heinous intentional westernization and colonial practices in Argentina, including the massacre of so many indigenous peoples, including this person's grandmother. So, for them, it was even personal. I hope I'm making sense here, but as I think about that conversation that I had with this Argentinian musician and think about this really incredible conversation that I had with Joachim, I hope that you will find it in yourself to really think differently about cultural appropriation. Yes, it certainly happens. I'm not saying cultural appropriation does not happen, but what also happens is assumptions made where cultural appropriation isn't actually happening, but rather the exposition, the demonstration of art making and culture bearing that actually has the permissions and the approvals and the background work and the homework that we would expect. Do we need someone to give their book report from the stage, really affirming what they've done to have that right? Or is it our job as audience members and supporters to give folks the benefit of the doubt and enjoy the show, enjoy the music, enjoy the recordings? I won't say that anyone's right or wrong for your perspectives on that, but I will say that I'm definitely lightening up and changing my tune when it comes to that sort of thing. I think there's something to be said about not having an expectation of wrongdoing, but really taking the art making and deciding for ourselves if we enjoy the art and if we care enough to have conversations, to reach out, to do whatever we have to do to learn otherwise if we're feeling a little icky about something, as opposed to just making assumptions. That's my 2 a.m. TED Talk for you. Thanks so much again for tuning in to the TRILLOQUY podcast. Wish me luck on my upcoming travels. I'm in and out of airplanes a lot for the next few weeks, but maybe I'll see if I can't get something published for you while I'm on the road with my little travel setup that I have yet to use. Thanks again. I'm repeating myself here. Stay dangerous, stay curious, stay compassionate. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And I'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.